If you've been watching this channel for some time, you know that I like to showcase obscure cars from around the world, and that's what we're going to do this time. And specifically, we're going to talk about a 1972 Pontiac that was not offered for sale in the United States, but was offered for sale in Canada as well as abroad. And that is the 1972 Pontiac Parisienne, or as the brochure has it listed here, the Parisienne Brougham. Now, I'm sure if you're a Pontiac aficionado, you're familiar with those names at the top of that brochure there, at least some of them. The Grand Prix, the Granville, by the way, which was Pontiac's range topper for the 1971 model year and as well for the 1972 model year and a few more years to come. The Bonneville, the Catalina, but what is this Parisienne Brougham as well as the Laurentian? Well, in Canada, unlike the U.S., Pontiacs were the volume brand. So Pontiac outsold Chevrolet all the way until the brand was sunset in Canada. And the dealer network was consequently very Pontiac-centric. And in this case, in order to get the appropriate level of volume needed for sales in Canada and to sell vehicles at an attractive price point, Pontiac was kind of a lower-end make than it was in the U.S. It was still viewed as an excellent vehicle, but you really didn't buy a Chevrolet unless you just wanted a box on four wheels in Canada. You bought a Pontiac. And if you wanted the top-of-the-line Canadian Pontiac, you would buy the Parisienne, at least up until the 1971 model year. That was when Pontiac in Canada started trying to merge its nameplates from the U.S. as well as Canada. And you get this confusing brochure here with a mix of the U.S. Catalina and Bonneville and Granville, and then you have the Laurentian and the Parisienne. And if I were a buyer in Canada, I'd say, well, what's the difference between the Catalina, Bonneville, and Granville? Well, it really was that the other vehicles, the Granville, Bonneville, and the Catalina, were imported from the U.S. The Parisienne and the Laurentian, in contrast, were originally built in Canada, and that started because of import duties and restrictions that really precluded General Motors from importing vehicles from the U.S. to Canada. But by this point, in the early 1970s, those were starting to relax, and hence you started to see some of these U.S. models being imported into Canada. But the Canadian value-conscious customer who was very familiar with the Parisienne brand as well as the Laurentian perhaps still wanted to buy one of those vehicles as opposed to U.S.-based Pontiac, which was a bit more expensive. And here's a page from the 1972 Canadian Pontiac brochure. You can see it talks about the Parisienne Brougham. And the first line there, if you know anything about Pontiac, you know Parisienne. Year after year, Canadians voted Parisienne the most popular of our Pontiacs. And this is really the reason why General Motors of Canada didn't want to stop selling it. But it was a vehicle that was very popular for quite some time in Canada. And the interesting thing about it is that, as I mentioned, the Parisienne was equipped differently from the Catalina, as an example, in the U.S., or the Bonneville, or the Granville. More specifically, it used a fair amount of Chevrolet-based components, including what was under hood. And that was, in the Parisienne Brougham, a standard 350 cubic inch Chevrolet small block V8. More specifically, let's take a list of this engine specifications brochure for General Motors of Canada. And more specifically, in 1972, the 350 cubic inch two-barrel V8 was standard in the Parisienne Brougham that we were just talking about. Now, Pontiac did offer a 350 cubic inch V8 that came out in 1968 and was around in the 1972 model year. But take a look at the bore and stroke dimensions here of the engines that are listed, and notice the 4-inch bore by 3.48-inch stroke for the 350 barrel V8 that's listed. Well, the Pontiac 350 V8 had a 3 3/4-inch stroke, not the listed stroke here. And what the difference is that this 350 barrel that's included in the brochure, and which was standard in the Parisienne in Canada, is the Chevrolet small block 350. Now, if you optioned up to the 400 or the 455, you got the true veritable Pontiac V8. But if you got the standard 350 cubic inch V8 in a Parisienne or whatever Canadian Pontiac you chose in the 1972 model, you got a Chevrolet 350 two-barrel V8 making 165 horsepower, 280 pound-feet of torque, as you see listed there. You also notice the 250 one-barrel 6 is listed. That was the standard engine in the Laurentian. Now, in the U.S., as I mentioned, you could not get a V8 that was smaller than 400 cubic inches in any of the full-size Pontiacs. The Catalina came standard with a 400 cubic inch two-barrel V8. So imagine your full-size Laurentian with a 250 cubic inch inline six-cylinder engine. That really must have been a dog. But the 350 turbo in these vehicles actually is just fine. And let's take a look at one particular low-mileage Parisienne that I unfortunately passed up on buying probably about 5 years ago, and I should have bought. I think it had maybe 20,000 miles, something like that on it. And, it was a cool vehicle, but these 72 Pontiacs are super awesome overall. I have to admit, I like the 71 styling a little bit better than the 72 because of the bumper, but it's still cool. In any event, let's take a look at this Parisienne. And here you have it. Unfortunately, the picture taker here, the seller, wasn't that great of a picture taker, but you can see this car is in excellent condition. Notice the Parisienne badging behind the front wheel there, as well as the pinstripe on the vehicle, which is pretty typical for the Parisiennes, accentuating in particular that rear quarter panel form as well as the front fender. The wheel covers are the same as the U.S. full-size Pontiac, and of course, the overall body is pretty much the same, but the trim is different. It does have that lower piece of stainless. You notice this car doesn't have any body side molding or door edge guards, but aside from that, it's pretty standard. And there's also not a rub strip in the front bumper. I suppose because in Canada, the bumper standard wasn't the same as the U.S., and they could get away with not having that bumper strip and saved a few pennies. Thank you, bean counters. Also lurking under hood in this one is that Chevrolet small block 350 V8, which we'll take a look at in a few more pictures. Let's turn first to the interior, though. And here we have the interior, specifically the dash of the 72 Parisienne, and you'll note this is not an air conditioning equipped car. There is not a setting for air conditioning on the climate control panel there on the right side. And you'll notice on the left side by the driver's hand that it says upper ventilation, basically open and close. So that's where you open the upper vents to let fresh air in. There's also not a vent on that left side, which the air conditioning cars would have. Now, aside from that, really the instrument panel is the same as the 1972 full-size Pontiacs in the U.S. You can see the seat pattern here, and the fabric is a little bit different. Let's take a look at that now more in detail. And here's the front seat. This is the factory seat. This has not been reupholstered. And this was a seat fabric as well as stitching pattern that was not available in the U.S. So it's unique to Canada, as were the door panels that you can see there that have a touch of elegance with that faux wood grain. But aside from that, they really don't have a common upper portion of the door panel that's shared with the US-based cars. The lower portion of the door panel with that armrest as well as the window crank was shared with the US cars. The upper portion was different and unique to the Parisienne. A lot of this unique content came about because the Parisienne and the Laurentian used Canada-based suppliers. And so they were using local suppliers so they could select really whatever they wanted. There was no economies of scale to be had by using the exact same fabrics as an example or producing the exact same door panel. And here's a view from the passenger side looking toward the driver's side. You'll notice again the instrument panel basically the same as the US-based cars, although it does say Parisienne there on the passenger side instrument panel area. And there's no reading light that you would have received on the Bonneville or Granville. Would have been kind of under that leftmost vent that you see in the picture. That came standard on the Bonnevilles and the Granvilles in the U.S., but was not part of the equipment package on the Parisiennes. There's also no bright work on the pedal trim here. And while you didn't get as much, let's say, luxury as you did on the U.S.-based cars, you certainly had a lot of room. Notice the rear seat room in this particular Parisienne. There is no rear seat armrest in this car either, so they decontented that. The door armrests do have ashtrays, though, and of course that was critical during this time period. You had to have a place to put your cigarette ash if you're sitting in the back seat, as there's no central ashtray that's in the middle of the seat. But plenty of room in these, and those seats were, I can tell you from having sat in them, were definitely comfortable. And here we have the heart of the beast, the small block Chevrolet 350 V8, which was standard in the Parisiennes and is under hood in this particular vehicle. Now, aside from the overall engine, there are some interesting differences versus the US-based cars. The first is that brace there that runs from the cowl over to the fender. There's just one of them, only on the passenger side. And it's not because the driver's side is missing. It's because it just wasn't so equipped. I guess they costed out that brace on the Canadian-based cars for whatever reason. Presumably they felt that it didn't add to the overall structural rigidity and just left it off. So you get one brace here. The radiator shroud is also a bit different. Notice this is not an air conditioning equipped car, as I mentioned before. But really, aside from that, the power brake booster, the master cylinder, the washer fluid bottle, all those things under hood are pretty standard. Of course, the Chevrolet 350 did come with its own air cleaner. The Pontiac air cleaner was a bit different, but, you know, like I said, this is the Chevrolet 350 that's under hood here and not a Pontiac V8. Well, there you have it, the 1972 Pontiac Parisienne equipped with a Chevrolet 350 cubic inch V8 straight from the factory. I wish that this vehicle had a few more options, and unfortunately, by the 1972 model year, Pontiac was not using Chevrolet engines across the entire lineup like they were a few years earlier. Would have been cool if you could still get a big block Chevrolet in the Parisienne as opposed to the 455. I definitely would have bought it if that had been the case. But nonetheless, I passed. I think I just had too many vehicles in the barn at the time, so to speak. Here is a picture of another 1972 Pontiac Parisienne, and you can see looks very similar to the US-based Pontiacs, although it does have a bit of trim, again, missing, and this one doesn't have a vinyl roof. You can see that a bit better here. I think the lack of a vinyl roof honestly makes the car look more tasteful. A lot of these vehicles in the US were equipped with the vinyl roof, particularly the upper-end Pontiacs, but the Parisiennes often didn't have them as you had to pay extra, and I think, candidly, it looks better without it. So if I were buying one of these in Canada at that time, I would not have paid extra for the vinyl top. But overall, still a handsome car. This one does have the body side molding as well as the rub strips in the bumper and fender skirts too. So there's a few differences on this one versus the previous one that you just saw. In any case, hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the 1972 Pontiac Parisienne. If you did, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.